There is a particular kind of effort that has never quite produced the respect it was reaching for. You have been agreeable, accommodating, careful never to cause friction. And still, somewhere beneath the politeness people extend to you, there is a subtle sense that your presence is optional rather than valued. You have worked so hard to be liked, and yet respect, the thing you actually needed, has remained just slightly out of reach. Why does likability so often fail to produce respect, even when pursued with genuine sincerity? Why do some people seem to command consideration effortlessly, without ever appearing to chase it at all? Before we explore this together, subscribe to this channel, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind everyday life. Picture a lantern carried steadily through a crowded room, its light constant regardless of who happens to be watching, neither dimming to avoid attention nor flaring to demand it. People are drawn toward a light like this, not because it performs for them, but because it never once wavers to secure their approval. Is that steadiness cold? Or is it simply the quality that makes a light worth trusting in the first place? Carl Jung believed that genuine respect is rarely extended to the persona, alone the polished, accommodating self performed for approval. It is extended, instead, to something steadier underneath, a self that remains consistent whether or not it is being watched, evaluated, or applauded. What if the psychological laws that generate respect were never actually about technique at all, but about the quiet, internal work of finally becoming someone worth respecting from the inside first? Here is the first law worth naming plainly. People respect boundaries far more than they respect accommodation. A boundary, stated once and held steadily, communicates something accommodation never can, that you know your own worth clearly enough not to negotiate it every time someone else applies pressure. Why does constant accommodation so often produce less respect rather than more? Because it signals, however unintentionally, that your position is always available for renegotiation, and what is endlessly negotiable rarely commands lasting regard. Consider how this plays out. The person who says yes to every request, regardless of their own capacity, is often quietly taken for granted, their time treated as infinitely available. The person who occasionally, calmly says no, without extensive justification, is treated with noticeably more consideration, not because they have become less kind, but because their kindness now appears to be a choice rather than a default. Jung might have said that a boundary reveals the presence of a self distinct enough to have limits at all, and a self with limits is far more compelling than one that simply accommodates indefinitely. Here is the second law. People respect consistency between word and action more than they respect charm. Charisma can capture attention quickly, but it evaporates just as quickly the moment it fails to align with follow-through. A person who says less, but reliably does what they say, builds a particular kind of trust that charm alone can never generate. Why does consistency carry more lasting weight than charisma, even though charisma is often more immediately impressive? Because charisma asks to be believed in the moment, while consistency proves itself gradually, over time, in ways that cannot be faked convincingly for very long. Alfred Adler believed that genuine social significance is earned not through performance, but through reliable contribution, being someone whose word can actually be trusted to predict their behavior. Is charm, examined honestly, actually a stable foundation for respect? Or is it, more precisely, a temporary impression easily undone the first time it fails to match reality? Here is the third law, perhaps the most difficult to practice consistently. People respect self-possession more than they respect approval-seeking. A person who remains calm in the presence of disagreement, who does not visibly need the room's validation to feel secure, projects a kind of stability that draws consideration naturally, without ever having to request it directly. Why does approval seeking so often produce the opposite of what it's chasing? Because visible neediness signals, even subtly, an internal uncertainty that others instinctively hesitate to invest their respect in. Jung called the process of developing this kind of self-possession individuation, becoming a person whose stability originates internally, rather than being continuously borrowed from whoever happens to be observing. And here's the harder truth worth sitting with. You cannot perform self-possession convincingly. People sense the difference between borrowed confidence and the real thing, the way they sense a flame that flickers inconsistently depending on who has just walked into the room. Picture the tree standing bare through winter, appearing from a distance like something finished, without depth. Beneath the surface, unseen, the roots continue their patient widening in the dark. Is the discomfort of holding a boundary or remaining calm without others' approval truly a sign of coldness? Or is it simply the visible cost of a root system finally growing toward something steadier than accommodation ever provided? This is the turn worth making gently here. Practicing these 3 laws will likely feel uncomfortable at first, particularly if your habits have long been built around accommodation and approval seeking. But this discomfort is often the early sensation of individuation beginning to take hold, becoming a person whose respect-worthiness is generated internally, rather than continuously performed for an external audience. It rarely feels graceful right away. It tends to feel, initially, like risking disapproval. Only later does it begin to feel like solid, self-generated ground. So how do you actually practice these laws, moment to moment? This is where the observer becomes essential, the quiet witness inside you capable of noticing the old urge to accommodate, perform, or seek approval before automatically acting on it. Not the part of you that immediately softens a boundary the instant someone pushes back. The part that can simply notice, calmly, I feel the pull to over-accommodate right now, and I do not have to follow it. Seneca often reminded himself that tranquility depends largely on releasing our need for others' approval, trusting instead in the steadiness of one's own principles. Can you feel the urge to seek validation rising in a room? And pause there, choosing instead to remain simply, calmly yourself. Can you allow a boundary to stand without immediately over-explaining it into something smaller and easier to dismiss? And here is something worth noticing. If you look honestly, the habits working against these 3 laws over accommodation. Inconsistency. Anxious approval seeking have likely repeated themselves across many relationships, many years, wearing different faces but following the same familiar shape. Why does life seem to recreate this same test again and again, in new rooms, with new people, until it is finally recognized and, eventually, released? Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious in us tends to reappear in our lives as pattern, the same anxious habits surfacing in new relationships that closely resemble the emotional architecture of earlier ones. Perhaps this is not really about the specific people currently in your life. Perhaps it is the newest version of an older question. When did you first learn that respect had to be earned through relentless accommodation? And are you finally ready to test a steadier approach instead? Viktor Frankl believed that between what happens to a person and how they respond, a space exists narrow, but entirely their own. You cannot control how quickly someone else's respect for you develops, but the space between the old urge to accommodate and the deliberate choice to remain steady instead, that space belongs entirely to you. So what do these 3 laws actually look like in ordinary practice? Not something dramatic. Not a sudden sweeping change in personality overnight. It might look like stating a boundary once, clearly, and resisting the urge to justify it 3 additional times. It might look like following through reliably on smaller commitments, even when no one would notice if you didn't. It might look like sitting calmly with someone's disapproval, without immediately scrambling to win back their favor. It might look like choosing consistency over charm, letting your actions build trust slowly rather than trying to impress a room instantly. None of this arrives with fanfare. Jung once suggested that people will do almost anything to avoid the discomfort of standing fully in their own authority, and if that is true, then simply holding a boundary steady, or remaining calm without external validation, may already be a significant act of quiet courage. Return, for a moment, to the lantern carried steadily through a crowded room. Imagine holding it now, Not to impress anyone standing nearby, not to prove anything to whoever happens to be watching, but simply because it is yours, and it burns the same regardless of who enters or leaves the room. Does that make the light less warm to the people who matter? Or does it simply mean the warmth, from now on, is offered by choice rather than by anxious necessity? And so, we return to the question beneath these three laws, beneath every boundary finally held, every promise reliably kept, every moment of steadiness chosen over anxious approval. What actually remains of you, once respect no longer needs to be chased, because it has finally, quietly, been earned from the inside out? What remains when your worth no longer depends on winning over every room you enter? Jung offered an answer that has outlasted him by nearly a century. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Perhaps respect was never something you needed to pursue at all. Perhaps it was simply the natural response to a person finally steady enough and honest enough to no longer need to chase it. If this resonated, subscribe to this channel and join us as we keep uncovering these hidden truths. Which of these three laws do you find hardest to practice consistently? Write it in the comments below, and let that lantern, wherever it burns in you, finally hold its own steady light.